Thank you for joining us today for planning and running an effective meeting. And let's get started by one more poll. Margaret and I would love to know kind of what you've experienced. A meeting that could have or should have been an email, no agenda, no clear idea of the purpose of the meeting, participants not engaged in the meeting, needed materials but they weren't available, or needed participants that didn't attend. So Brittany's bringing that poll up, and you can, oops, it says single choice. Hopefully try to do as many as you can, because our assumption is that you've probably experienced many of these. So hopefully the poll will allow you to do that. And if not, then just choose the one that's like the most that you've seen. And we'll give you just a minute to do that. As you're finishing that, if there's one that you've experienced that has brought you here today, and that we don't have on this poll, please feel free to put that in the chat also. All right, how are we doing there, Brittany?
Yep, we're holding pretty steady, so I will go ahead and close that and then share results.
All right, so once again, we're pretty evenly spread out, except that everybody's had their materials, so that's good. And speaking of that, Brittany is going to put in our chat today the agenda for this webinar and a note-taking sheet, because we are hoping that we are going to, although this isn't technically a meeting, it's a presentation, we did want to model some effective practices. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. And thank you for sharing kind of what you have experienced. And nobody's put anything in the chat yet, so we'll keep. If you want to put something else in, feel free to do that. Here's the deal: you're not alone. People experience ineffective meetings for a lot of different reasons, and there's a quick look on the internet for memes. We found all kinds of them. So let's just share a few to get us started this morning. Willy Wonka saying, "Tell me more about this morning meeting. Is it more important than my coffee?" I don't do a very good Willy Wonka voice, so sorry about that. But what about Dory saying, "I really need less meetings in my schedule. Oh, look, another meeting invite." And lastly, Yoda. Team meeting there is. Send agenda items, you must. Not a very good impersonation of Yoda either, but thanks for hanging there. And love that Christine says she's experienced them all. And Brittany, thank you for putting the agenda in. And one more, and this is the best one of the day. It's how to make meetings shorter. Everybody's holding plank there. So maybe if you want to, feel free to engage with us by holding plank if you want to. It is going to be probably a long time. We're going to be in time, but just letting you know. And there's a little quote there. Humor comes from truth. And this author wrote, seriously, Why Humor is a Secret Weapon in Business and Life. And it's a book that I highly recommend. And we're going to circle back to humor later and the importance of humor in meetings and in presentations. But at this point, let's move forward and tell you who your guides are to planning and eliminating meeting mishaps. So Margaret, if you would be so kind, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why you're doing this presentation today.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Margaret Segerston, and as far as why I'm doing this meeting is because Sarah reached out to me and coaxed me into this idea, and quite honestly, I think I said no a couple times, but at any rate, as far as meetings, this has been something I've been working on for years. There's nothing worse than going to a bad meeting and you've got other things to do, right? So as far as what got me here, I've been a middle school teacher. I've been an assistant principal, a curriculum assessment and grant coordinator. I've been an athletic director, a coach. So I've been to thousands upon thousands upon thousands of meetings. And I can't say that all of them were great. I did have some great meetings, which is what I like to focus on. But there were also some time suckers in there. So that's kind of what brought me here. So thank you, Sarah, for this invitation. And I'm hoping that some people can learn some things, because I like to be strategic in my meeting planning. And hopefully you will be too, or you already are, and can learn a couple different things from us today.
Thanks, Margaret. And as Margaret mentioned, that she's had a lot of different roles. She's currently the Director of Adult Education at Regional Office of Education number 33. We are both from Title II. I'm the Director of the Southern Illinois Professional Development Center. And I'm going to tell you why I kept asking Margaret. That's correct. She did tell me no several times, but I don't usually take no for an answer. When I see excellence, I love to spotlight it. And Margaret, in some of our collaborative work, was inviting me to attend virtually a meeting that they were having in person at ROE 33 in their partnerships with Carl Sandburg College. And she did such a fabulous job of running meetings. I'm like, oh my gosh, we all have so much to learn from Margaret. So we're teaming up today. And I'm going to probably do a little more of the play-by-play, and Margaret's going to do the color commentary. If you're a sports fan, you get that reference. And so why I'm here is I'm like Margaret. I have attended and run thousands of meetings over the years. I started to do the math, and then it sort of made me depressed. I will tell you that in 19 blah, 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 I was student council president in my high school. That's when I first started running meetings. And I started to really think about, and I've continued over the years, when I go to a good meeting, I always think about what made it good. And when I go to a meeting that wasn't quite so good, I'm like, well, why? Why was this not an effective meeting? And so that led me to thinking about, like, what can I control and what can't I control in a meeting? And that's going to be a common theme in the things that we talk about, because we're going to talk a lot about what you can control and what can set you up for success. Now, I will say that Margaret and I both, we don't have a full hour of content on purpose, because we want to allow time for you to ask questions. So if you have questions throughout, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll address them as they become relevant to our conversations, or try to think about, if you have very specific, like, hey, what would you do in this instance? Feel free to ask those kinds of questions. And okay, thank you, Susan. I'm going to go ahead and read what you put in the chat. My favorite of all time was a meeting we had to discuss reducing the amount of meetings. And she's quick to say this was in a different job. So, that the recording, Susan knows she's being recorded, so she's going to say that was in a different job and several years ago. But thank you for sharing that. Okay, so let's get started with what our goals are for today in this session, because that's good modeling. Once again, what are our outcomes? So this is what Margaret and I came up with after reading some research, having conversations with each other about meetings, is we hope that at the end of this hour, you can list essential components of an effective meeting. And we are going to share with you links actually in your note pages that Brittany put in the chat, and it was also emailed to you if you've been registered for a few days, links to all of the research articles that we used. And so you don't have to memorize them, but we want you to be aware of them. Identify research-based principles of effective meetings. We want you to feel comfortable creating an agenda and an action plan for use in effective meetings. And we're going to give you a template for that as we move along in this. And we also want you to laugh and have at least one aha moment in this training. And so possibly we've already checked the box and laughed, or hopefully you liked our memes that we had, but that's part of what we'll circle back to humor later. Okay, so those were the goals that we set up and the outcomes that we'd like to see. We would like for you to consider the following. This hour will be worth my time if the following happens. Okay, so we want you to please share, and we'd like for you to put it in the chat, what you want to achieve in the next precious hour of your time. And as you're thinking about that, yes, I am going to keep talking because I want to frame this. Why are we doing this? Number one, we know that effective meetings, people are allowed to a voice, they're allowed to share, they're allowed to They're allowed to have input on the agenda. Now, we didn't allow you to necessarily do that ahead of time, but if you tell us something that you want us specifically to cover, and thank you, Susan, for getting us started, that you want to run effective meetings. If you have anything specific, then we're going to try our best to make sure that we cover that in this next hour. Also, from an educational standpoint, Margaret and I are both lifelong educators. We know from research that whenever we ask our brains, when we activate our brains on what we want, we are much more likely to pay attention and look for that. And we're going to be much more strategic and effective learners. And so we want to make sure that you have that down for you. So if you didn't put something in the chat, that's okay. But please tell yourself, hey, this is what I'm looking for. So we've got learn new strategies for an effective meeting and use at least one consistently. Thank you. Identify some concrete steps for improving my department meetings. Awesome. How to deal with an unwilling yet needed participant in a meeting so it does not railroad the entire meeting. And I love that Margaret is laughing about that. Yes. Okay. Thank you for giving us that very specific. We'll talk about that. Strategies to facilitate effective meetings, strategies for making meetings vital to everyone, effectively engage participants, and how to make mundane topics interesting. Awesome. Talk about that. Usable bullet points to help me create agendas and manage meetings well, to not get hijacked by another person who are encouraged to share. Okay. Those are awesome. And thank you for sharing all those. And I can see Margaret's making some notes. And then lastly, we've got strategy for ending the meeting with a clear sign of progress. We love that. So once again, we do have some resources for you, and very specifically. So I feel like we're going to talk about a lot of the things that you mentioned. And at the end, we're going to circle back and make sure that you got what you came for. Because if you didn't, then we want to make sure that we find a way to help you think through that. All right. So again, thank you for sharing this next hour with us. Here's our agenda, and you also have it in a handout. We're going to talk first about meeting planning. Do you need a meeting? Meeting types, purposes, who should attend, preparing and sharing the agenda, staying on time, one of my favorites, making your meeting engaging, which somebody put in the chat already. The importance of notes and action items. Again, that's like when we end, what's happening? We will also put this on the agenda. This is now for all of you linear thinkers out there. This does not have to happen right after importance of notes and action items to laugh and nod your head, but at least once we want you to do that, or maybe 16 times would be better. Play to your strengths, and then we will have a time for questions and for sharing strategies. Okay, let's start rolling. Proper prior planning prevents poor performance. The 6 Ps. I learned this first in college. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Blankenship. I haven't seen him in decades, but he's the one who said this, and I've remembered it ever since. And taking time up front to plan is going to save you time later on. And I know we all get so busy, and it's hard to sometimes, we've got all those emails coming at us, or people coming to our door, or people needing things from us. So, but we really do want to make sure when we're having a meeting that there is the proper planning. Whenever I was getting ready for this, I actually saw that there's a little change in that, or a potential change. And I like this because our goal should be higher than simply not having poor performance. We want to have peak performance. So proper prior planning promotes peak performance. That's what we're going for today. All right. So our content. Before you call the meeting, here's what what do you want to accomplish? Be clear on why it's being called. This also, as a meeting attendee, if you're not clear why somebody else is calling a meeting, this is a great time, if they're sending it out, say, hey, can you just give me what's the objective here? What are the goals? Because you can also, that happens on the planning end, but then you can also question that. Depending on who it is, we realize that there's sometimes that you don't get to ask. Why is this meeting being called? But oftentimes you can. And then go ahead, Margaret.
Sarah, I'd like to kind of comment a little bit on that. Is what I've learned over the years is I like to start with the outcome of the meeting. When when I think of planning for a meeting, to me, it's much like planning a lesson plan or a unit from my, K-12 background. I like to start with the end in mind, and I like to really know what my intention is of that outcome. And once you know what that intention is, it's easier to plan the rest of the meeting, if that makes any sense.
Makes perfect sense. Thanks for throwing that in. Yeah, and what will be the success? If this is accomplished, whatever that is, fill in the blank, then I know that it's been successful. Is a meeting required?
Oftentimes when you're asking yourself about that outcome, you're going to be able to ask yourself then, does it even require a meeting?
Right.
And then you can just check that right on off.
Right, for sure. And you know what? Unless it's a meeting that's required, is it in statute that you have to meet? And there are such meetings. Otherwise, that is a really good question that Margaret just said. Do we need this? Can we maybe collaborate on a shared doc or in an email or have a conversation and we're good to go? So before you call that meeting, is it really needed? And what do you want to accomplish? And then what type of meeting are you having? This is one that really helps me. And Margaret's shaking her head and smiling. So I'm going to let Margaret talk a little about what kind of meeting are you having?
Sure. So, looking at that outcome, you start asking yourself what type of meeting it's going to be. Are you getting to that decision? Is it a status report? All those different questions come to mind. And I think before all of this it's starting with the relationships, right, of those people that are attending those meetings, and spend some time in those meetings building those relationships, because that's going to be the what makes that peak performance even better and faster to get to. And then empowering others. When you're asking these questions, you want to be thinking ahead of how you're going to be empowering others to speak and to ask questions and to throw their ideas out there. So those are some things that I like to keep in mind as I'm planning a meeting.
And Margaret, I know you do this because it was one of the things that impressed me is not only do you know what kind of meeting that you're having, you share that information with whoever you're inviting to the meeting so they know, oh, this is a meeting that we're going to brainstorm a whole bunch of ideas, or this is a meeting that we need to come out and make a decision that this is the next action. And sometimes it's a meeting that's pieces of all of that put together,
Mm-hmm.
but understanding and communicating what do we want to accomplish makes a long way in having that success. And you talked about relationships. I think people appreciate when you do communicate that ahead of time because you're saying, I value your time. And it's important that you're here because you're going to make a difference. And I value that. And we're going to be very strategic in the way that we work through this meeting. Anything else you want to say, Margaret, on what type of meeting you're having?
No, I think you did a great job summing that up.
All right, great. So who needs to attend and how long should it last? Again, Margaret talked about knowing what your objectives are, what you're starting, and knowing what you want to accomplish is really going to help you to know who needs to attend. If it's decision-making meeting and there are certain people, maybe your funder is going to come. Well, if you can't make a decision without the funder there, then they probably need to be at that meeting. Also, who do you know who has good ideas? If it's a brainstorming session, you want to make sure you have some inventors there. If you've ever gone to a meeting where there's brainstorming and it fell flat, yeah. And I'm not saying that everybody doesn't have good ideas, but that person who's like, hey, boom, 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 boom. How about these kinds of things? You want to make sure that you have that person there, and maybe they're not even directly invested, but maybe you're going to call in a favor and say, hey, can you come? Because you need that energy in the room of that person. And that's what plant support means. If you're going to have somebody or ask somebody who will support you or help to ask clarifying questions or to provide other information, because again, and this is especially true in virtual meetings when there's like nothing happening, nobody's sharing. And Margaret, you're laughing again, so I'm thinking you have something to share about that.
No, you just brought up some a great times here recently. So
Okay, all right. And somebody, I think, put in that they wanted some information about how do you get people to attend who you need to have there. How do you deal with an unwilling yet needed participant in a meeting so it does not railroad the entire meeting? Any thoughts about that, Margaret, as we're at this slide? And I'm really throwing you under the bus. So if you feel free to say you need to think about that a little bit more.
well, as far as the railroaders, you really have to think of what the intention is behind the railroading. Perhaps it's time and things of that nature that they don't have time for a meeting, so it's easier for them to railroad, and maybe they become the timekeeper. So trying to get to know the why behind the railroading is something that I like to get to. Sometimes just having them take notes is a great thing. Maybe they're not feeling empowered or whatever it might be. Um, but it's okay to say let's stick to the agenda for that person that's railroading that meeting, and we'll get to this later or discuss it later. Those are just some different ideas.
I love all those ideas, Margaret, and they kind of play into some of the things we have on the screen. Time is precious, use it wisely. I mean, having that conversation is, why do they not want to come? Maybe it's like, oh my gosh, we meet every week. I've had people say before, I've got to get my real work done. I don't have time for meetings. So that speaks volumes. I love Margaret's suggestion of having a conversation with somebody, like finding out their why is really helpful. And then the last one is beware of disruptors, both positive and negative. And, so that is, again, comes back to those relationships Margaret mentioned before. If you know the players, and that doesn't always happen because sometimes you're having an introductory meeting, but getting to know people and knowing their why. The negative are the people who are like, oh, that won't work. We tried that 2 years ago and it fell flat. So though that's why you need to plant that support. Somebody who says, yeah, but we've got different people involved this time. So maybe we want to, those kinds of things. The positive disruptor of the people who like keep throwing out ideas whenever you're in a meeting where we need to get stuff done. So Margaret's laughing at that as well, and hopefully that rings true to some of you as well. And I have somebody, and I will just say that is something that's happened to me recently. And so I've had to say, let's stick the agenda for today. And maybe we need to have progress on this particular project now, but you have a great idea. So we're going to put it over here and come back to it for the next round. Is that okay with you? And I found that to be very effective in that person who wants to kind of take us down a road that we're not staying on track. Or maybe that negative disruptor saying, okay, maybe you and I can talk about that later. For right now, we need to stick to the agenda or we need to move forward, those kinds of things. And thank you. We had Dion said, maybe the person feels like they don't have another space to express themselves. Mm-hmm. And Margaret, you were kind of talking about that, about having a voice.
Right. And really making sure they're engaged and getting to that why is always good. I want to kind of address part of this is how long should it last? And one of the things we have students Monday through Thursdays, but on Fridays, we don't have any students. So we've kind of taken advantage of that. And it sounds awful, to be honest with you, but a 6-hour meeting, for gosh sakes, I would just be like cringing at that thought. But yes, I have planned 6-hour meetings on Fridays. And it's, those meetings that last that 6 hours, there's different purposes. They're like mini meetings that have been built in. And it was really odd this past Friday when I walked away and people were saying that was a great meeting. I'm like, what are you talking about? It was a 6-hour meeting, and they broke it down and we got so much accomplished, and we planned, or I intentionally planned, mini meetings in there, and the instructors were engaged throughout. They were, looking at their data, getting some things done together and working together and having conversations around their data and coming up with new ideas. And, we broke off into teams. So it's okay. Just, you got to know what your purpose is for the meeting. And you can string those mini meetings together. And some of our instructors found that that was even more helpful than having multiple meetings throughout a week or throughout a month. So just some things to keep in mind when you talk about how long should it last. So just a thought.
And I love the idea of like stringing meetings sometimes, especially depending on the project, because when you have momentum going, you want to build on that momentum for sure. All right. 6-hour meetings for Margaret Stegerson. Right there. You got it. And knowing Margaret
my
was
idea.
great idea. Okay. So one of the foundational pieces of an effective meeting is planning and sharing the agenda, and sharing the agenda ahead of time and allowing people to have that voice in what's going to be on the agenda. And somebody talked about somebody hijacking an agenda. If they get some voice ahead of time to decide what's going to be on there, then you're probably going to set yourself up for a little bit of success. So we want to make sure we allow input. Knowing ahead of time that it's great in a calendar invite. There's lots of ways to share an agenda. And in a minute, Margaret's going to show you some of her agendas and kind of what has made them effective. But I think an agenda at least 24 hours in advance, possibly more, is very helpful. Let's see. One other thing that I was going to mention is by putting agendas, if it's in person and you can have a good old-fashioned paper agenda, put it in front of them. If it's in a calendar invite, or I'll send it out right before the meeting if it's a virtual meeting, or even an in-person meeting if you don't want to print it. If you've ever been looking for materials for a meeting, you know that you're thinking about finding the agenda or other supporting documents, and your cognitive energy is not on the important stuff, which is the items on the agenda. And that is just the way that happens. So we want to set people up for success by giving them very easily, here's what you need. People are so busy that they love when you serve it up on a platter. Margaret?
And here again, Sarah, when you're talking about different meetings with different partners and things of that nature, sometimes just keeping a very similar agenda from meeting to meeting is really your best tool. And then, like you said, having that agenda on that meeting invite and anything else that you need for that meeting really keeps that meeting flowing. I like to do that, especially. I think, Sarah, you've been at some of our meetings where I've tried to put everything on that calendar invite as I can that people will need for the meeting. So again, setting up for success. And then that way people have it ahead of time that can ask a question if they're not understanding something right away.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, what to consider in planning the agenda, and what you see on your screen and a lot of the other information is in that meeting planning template that Margaret and I are going to give you at the end, and it's also in your notes. But your priorities, what absolutely must be covered. Margaret and I both feel very strongly about having some relationship building and having time to get to, that early conversation and meeting, but then also like that's answering the question, I need to have this completed in order for it to be a success. So what are my priorities? Talking about that, probably setting up your agenda, the most important things at the top. Results, what do you need to accomplish? Participants, who needs to attend for it to be successful? I know there's some overlap in what we've already talked about. Also sequence, in what order will you cover the topics? Obviously, again, if you are not sure you're going to get to everything, you want to put the most highest priority at the beginning. Timing, how much time will you spend on each topic? If you've ever been at that meeting where, it's an hour-long meeting and the first item, you're like 45 minutes in, you're like, oh my gosh, I don't think we're going to get to the other 5 items because we're 45 minutes in. So is it something you need to table and come back to if you're talking too long? Is it something that you need to call another meeting? The date and time, when will the meeting take place? And then where will the where will the meeting take place, and is it going to be a virtual meeting, an in-person meeting, all of those kinds of things. And these all came from a resource that Margaret and I found called Mind Tools. And again, those links are in your notes for today. Okay, a lot of stuff on the screen here, Margaret. Thoughts, or do you just want to go straight to one of your sample agendas and kind of talk about it in context?
I think the sample agenda would be a nice way to transition. So in that, this is just a sample agenda for some meetings with some various different partners, and making sure that the time and the place is indicated so that they have this ahead of time, and what room are we going to be meeting in, and clearly communicating the purpose of the meeting so they know exactly what they're coming to and the why behind it. And then at the end, if it's going to be a successful meeting, what are we going to come away with? So we're going to know exactly who the students are in our ICAPS programs. We're going to know exactly where our support class, what the schedule is going to be, where the location for our support class is going to be. And we're going to start talking about our cybersecurity ICAPS by the end of this meeting. By the way, this meeting has not occurred yet because of all the wonderful snow and cold weather. But at any rate, that's the outcome for this meeting when it does occur. And then we have a place for whoever's going to be taking the notes, because I don't do a very good job taking notes when I'm running a meeting. So I always assign that to somebody else. So who's in attendance at that meeting? And then one of the things that I like to ask at the beginning of a meeting, is there anything that needs to be added to the agenda? We can always say no. But if it's something that another partner brings forward, we can always add that if it's important at that time. Or maybe it's a discussion that we're going to push it off to the next meeting, and that's okay too. So those are some things that as far as our meeting agenda. And then towards the end, we make sure that we assign those different roles to people so that we know that whatever we're going to be working on, people know what their roles are when we come back to the next, or their task, I guess I should say, when we come to the next meeting the next month, so that we continue to make progress.
And Margaret, you have one other little more involved. I think this is your 6-hour meeting. Do you want to, is there anything different you want to? Yeah.
So in this particular meeting, I like to, start with our mission and our vision, and keep that right up there in front for everybody, because everybody's coming from different angles. These are various different instructors that we have in our program. And again, the purpose is there, and the outcomes for our meeting. So we were going to review our data to make sure that it was in DAISY. That's our where we keep our data, making sure that it's up to date. We're going to celebrate our accomplishments. So we try to build that into all of our meetings, because oftentimes we kind of get bogged down, and it's nice to hear about the different celebrations that are going on. So we always build that into our meetings. And then an opportunity to improve our bridge and our ICAPS, because that's new to us. We have a new bridge program. And so getting that feedback from people. So those were our outcomes of the meeting. And then some team norms that we decided upon. You can read through those. Those are things that we try to measure throughout our meetings that we are doing as professionals, and making sure that people's voices are heard. I think the biggest one there is number 7. There is really presuming positive intention. So, and then you get down to the meat of our meeting, and I've got it kind of lined out there as far as how much time each thing is going to take. On this particular meeting, the data took longer than the 8 to 10 o'clock. And so, and that was okay. We adjusted, but the instructors broke out into teams, and they had some great conversations around data. And then you can see how the other things are broken out there. And then we continued to meet during lunch, and they wanted to do this. And that's where we came up with some of our different improvement ideas, and had that discussion while we continued on with lunch. And then we broke out again for some team meetings again. So it was very active during this 6-hour. It wasn't just sitting and getting.
Yeah, it sounds like you kind of switched gears multiple times, which is helpful. Margaret, I'm wondering, how did you come up with your team norms? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can actually. So before I came to my role as the director of adult ed, there was some work, some professional development work that was already done by ROE 33. And I want to say that it might have been cognitive coaching. And in that professional development, I believe it was cognitive coaching anyway, they had done some surveys by each department. And so the adult ed had taken a survey around these 7 different topics. And so we talked about that when I first started. And this is what we landed on, that we really want to come to our adult ed meetings and focusing on these 7 different norms, so to speak. And so this is what we agreed upon, so that we keep that on our meeting agendas. And then at the end of our meetings, we come back and we evaluate how we did. Did we pause? Did we listen? Did we paraphrase what other people were saying? Those different things.
I love that. Thank you. I mean, I feel like you guys, even if that's the one thing you take away from here of having team norms, that's awesome. So thank you for sharing that. And presuming positive intentions is huge. Okay, moving on, asking, and Brittany, thank you very much for putting those sample agendas that Margaret so graciously shared in the chat if you are interested in having that as sort of a little bit of a template. Ask your attendees to be present. We want to make sure we encourage participation by all. And I feel like Margaret really set us up for success there. If you're asking people ahead of time, what do you want to talk about on the agenda? What do you want to accomplish? Then you're going to be encouraging participation. Asking different people to speak up. And you may have noticed that on Margaret's agenda that it was announcement time or sharing time. And so with people have time to share what they're concluding or what they're finding, that's going to, again, encourage that participation. And I believe that was somebody else's goal today, was making it engaging. Assigning tasks. Margaret talked about that in her in context with the meeting that she had. People had different jobs to do. Maybe somebody's the note taker. Somebody else is keeping the time clock. Somebody else is, asking questions. Maybe you want to change voices every so often, like Margaret and I are doing. It helps the brain to pay attention if you hear different people talking and different people sharing. So even just asking maybe someone else to take a portion of the meeting and talk about it that is another way to get engagement. One of the things that has really been helpful for my work team is we have a weekly meeting on Friday, and we have a shared agenda that is a Google Doc that we all have access to, and we all just add to the agenda every week. And sometimes, so everybody gets a voice, number one. Number two, some of the things that I want to share or others want to share are just informational. And it's really important that I share this information, but it's not like we're going to talk about it a whole lot. I just need you to know this. So putting it there, people kind of look at it ahead of time, and they come into the meeting already knowing some of the background information that we need. And most people like that empowerment of saying, okay, I already know what I need to know. And I was able to process it and spend time thinking about it. So I didn't get information overload at a meeting. So allowing people time to take a look. I'm going to say cameras on for a virtual meeting. That's a tough one. And I'm going to let me say all of my disclaimers. Number one, I can tell you that whenever I'm in a virtual meeting, I get a lot of feedback from people. And Margaret's been doing that. Like, she's shaking her head, she's smiling, she's laughing. So sometimes I know, oh, Margaret wants to say something. And that was from my visual cue that I would not have if she didn't have her camera on. There are a lot of reasons that maybe a person can't or doesn't want to put on their camera. Maybe they're having bad internet connection. It takes too much bandwidth. Margaret was telling me about a meeting recently that there were 70 people, 70 cameras on. That really doesn't help because that's way too many. But I am saying to you that I think, especially in a kind of a team building meeting or a meeting that there's 12 or less people, I personally would ask people to turn their cameras on, and I would tell them why. It helps me to think about what others are saying and to be able to get the verbal feedback from them. Okay, I went on and on about being present. Margaret, Other thoughts?
No, I think you really summed it up really nicely.
Well, then let's stay on time. And that's our next one, because it's very important. And we already promised you at the beginning, we like made bold claims that we were going to stay on time. So we best do that. And let me throw that to you, Margaret, because I've been talking for a while. Let's hear a different voice. What are some things about keeping on time?
So as far as staying on time, this is really one of my big ones. We have to be really respectful to others. If they're taking time out of their day to attend that meeting, they've got other things going on. So I'm really big on starting on time and ending on time. And I'm that timekeeper. So I'm constantly looking at the time. If the conversation's going on too long, I'm moving it along. So I think, staying on time is that big respectful one to the people that are attending your meetings. If you're, asking some people to come in, we have what we call a rotating seat. If you're having somebody come into that rotating seat, you want to be able to tell them what time the meeting starts, what time the meeting ends, so that if you have a need down the road, that they're going to show up again when you need them. So I think the other big thing is it's okay to end early too. I haven't heard anybody ever complain about a meeting finishing early. So making sure that you appoint that timekeeper, that's one of those things. If that's not your strength, make sure you appoint that. Letting people know that you value your time, you're doing that just by starting on time and ending on time. And then taking a break. I think that's important too, or letting people know that they can take a break on their own. If you've got this long 6-hour meeting, I want to put it out there. We've got some breaks built in, but take a break when you need to take a break, because I want people to be at the meeting and engaged in the meeting. And then the biggest one that I've learned over time is don't recap for the latecomers. That is something that I am currently working on, because there's nothing worse than being on time to a meeting and then hearing the recap once or twice for that latecomer. That's not respectful for that person that came to the meeting on time. So that's something that I'm really working on, because that was something that I used to do a lot of. So that's a little bit that I have to say about staying on time. How about you, Sarah?
Well, I'm going to focus on that last one because it's really hard for me. I try to make sure that everybody's included. That's my positive intention. However, I had a mentor years ago who used to always say, I don't like to punish people who are on time. And what you just said, Margaret, if you're recapping every time, then you really are punishing the people who are on time. And here's the way that I think that we can accomplish all things. And that is, if we have shared notes that are being taken, then the person who comes in later still can go back and look at those notes and catch up. And we're going to come to note taking in just a minute. So we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get there.
And one more thing about staying on time, Sarah, is I think it's also important to when you do have that latecomer or that person that needs to step out of the meeting for a little bit, it is really assuming those positive intentions. I think sometimes people get kind of sidetracked thinking that when somebody steps out of a meeting that they're being disrespectful. And I have to assume positive intentions, because there's a reason that they're stepping out of a meeting, and they don't need to share that with me right then and there, or maybe even ever.
Right. That's a great point. And again, assuming positive intentions. Love that you brought that up again. And making your meeting engaging. I think having norms that you start with is going to make people engaged. Assigning parts of the meeting to others. Margaret and I have already talked about that, but that helps to keep people engaged. If you know that you have a part coming up, you're going to be much more involved in that. If you know that you're going to be asked periodically, hey, what do you think about this? Especially if you have that person in your group who's a very deep thinker, but maybe they're not as extroverted and they're not going to necessarily speak up, then that's a great, if you know that, then that's a great periodically to be the person to call on them and say, hey, I'm just wondering what you're thinking right now, or all the things that you've heard, what's going through your head right now. I'm not putting people on the spot, but knowing that that you value what they think, number one, and number two, that you might be called upon every so often. Encourage feedback. What are you guys thinking? How are you feeling at this point? And then assigning action items, which was another one of the goals that somebody had. And I love when we have a shared agenda and then the note taker also is putting down, like, here's an action item, and we call it out. Margaret said, call out successes and celebrations. Also say, okay, hold on, that's an action item. Who's going to do that? And call it out at that moment and make it part of the notes from that. One of my best things that I love is when you have shared notes and you highlight in yellow, here's all the things and who's going to do it. Because then that gives you a really great place to come back and say, okay, did this happen? Margaret talked about that a few minutes ago about with the agenda. If you have it on top, like this is what we want to accomplish, then you have a starting point for the next one, for the next meeting. What do you think, Margaret? Anything in addition?
Well, the other thing that I like to think about is after the meeting is I take time to reflect, and I really reflect on, well, who was doing the talking, and if it was one sided, maybe it was all me, or not. I don't know, but if it was one sided, begin to make a plan for that next meeting so that others are more engaged. Is it timing? Is that why people weren't engaged? Did you plan the meeting during a snowstorm? That happened here recently, and 70 people were quiet. Well, I wasn't 70, but it was a good 20 people that were very quiet because I was more worried about my car and was I going to be able to get my car out? So it could just be timing of that meeting, and you didn't reschedule it. So just being reflective of how that meeting went after the meeting so that you can plan future meetings and maybe improve them if they need to be improved.
And Margaret, do you sometimes go back to maybe someone who attended the meeting to get a little after, like a post-game analysis from them?
Absolutely. I think that's so critical, and making sure that it's not always the same voice, and maybe sometimes that critical person, going back to them and having an honest conversation. And that's the way that you improve the meetings and get them to be more positive in the meetings. And again, it goes back to the relationships.
Relationships, that's the foundation of everything. And Margaret's shaking her head yes, and I know how she runs her meetings and her teams, and I know that she believes that. Okay, I mentioned taking notes. You can see on this note page, it says it's the best meeting ever. You don't have to have a shared doc, but a shared doc is a great way to, people can reference them in real time and take a look at them, whether it's an in-person or virtual meeting. Margaret already talked about asking someone to help. It is really hard, if not impossible, to effectively run a meeting and take the notes. So you need to get somebody who's going to take those notes and oops, let me go back to that. And then we want to make sure that we share notes after the meeting or even during the meeting so that people know what happened and know what those action items are and know what the timeline is. What else, Margaret? Anything else on note taking?
I think the biggest thing is be honest with yourself. Know your strengths. I know that is not a strength of mine. And so I have pawned that off on every single meeting that I've ever run, I think. And when I don't, the notes are awful. I got to tell you.
Yeah. And a good note taker is worth his or her weight in gold. We love that. And we love that role that they play.
Absolutely.
We've talked a little bit about this, but plan to laugh and gain consensus. Laughter relieves stress and boredom. It boosts engagement and well-being and spurs creativity and collaboration, as well as analytic precision and productivity. So if you're feeling like, oh, we can't laugh about things, we're in a serious meeting, there is actually research, and the research came from Wharton, MIT, and London Business School, that every chuckle or gawk brings with it a host of business benefits. And that was a direct quote. And that information is on one of your the research links that we gave you. But here's the other thing. Margaret talked about playing to your strengths. If that's not your strength, that levity, the making of a little joke, maybe you ask somebody, you empower somebody else. Hey, at some point, can you, if it's getting tense, can you maybe help us break that tension? Find that person who really, that is their strength. Margaret, I can tell you, has a natural wit about her. So a lot of times in her meetings, it's easy for her to kind of break a little bit of boredom by saying something funny or kind of, I don't know, just that's a natural part for her. And so that's one of her strengths. And if it's not your strength, find someone who can help you with that.
It's interesting that you say that, Sarah, because I do not see that as my strength. So thank you very much.
I think Margaret has a dry wit about her. And Margaret's already talked about this one as we come across the finish line for planning and running effective meetings, play to your strengths. And Margaret's mentioned this several times. Know yourself, know what you're good at, know where you may need support, and then plan ahead of time to ask for that. Plant that support. Maybe there needs to be somebody who rallies the troops if you're starting to, especially again, in a virtual meeting, sometimes that can be tough. Somebody who can say, yeah, you're right, I agree with that. Or, hey, can you tell us a little bit more about that if people are, don't seem to be engaged. And maybe there's somebody who's really good at synthesizing information and you can call on them every so often and say, hey, Brittany, what are you, and Brittany, I'm not actually calling on you, don't, but Brittany, what are you thinking? What are you seeing? And I will tell you, I am in meetings with Brittany and she is a very deep thinker. And that is something I've started doing is saying, Brittany, what do you think? And it's a great, like, that is a strength for her. I know she's going to bring some great thoughts to the meeting. What else, Margaret?
Well, as far as playing to the strengths, again, I already talked about the notes, and my strength is timekeeper. So I know that about myself, but I got to tell you, Sarah has a huge strength. So later on, you're going to get a template that is going to be shared with you. And I absolutely love this meeting template that Sarah put together. It was like everything that I ever dreamed of in my head. She organized it all in such a way that I think is going to help you guys plan more effective meetings. So I applaud Sarah for pulling that together, and I can't wait to use it.
Awesome. And you teed up the next slide perfectly, Margaret. So thank you. We have some tools for you to use, and Brittany's already put the sample agendas in the chat. The research citations are on the note pages that Brittany's already put in, and the notes from the presentation that I just referenced. And then the plan action template and for running an effective meeting. So Brittany, if you'll put that one in the notes, that really is our last resource that we have for you. We also are very willing to answer questions if you have any. I think we have mentioned a little bit of everything that you guys put in the chat earlier, but we have just a couple of minutes left. So if anybody has any questions and they would like to put them in the chat, otherwise, we thank you very much for attending today, and we thank you for the work that you're going to do to have awesome meetings. Margaret, what else do you want to share?
I just really appreciate the fact that you asked me to do this, and I'm coming away with a new template for my meeting. So thank you so very much. That was worth everything to me.
Awesome. And I've had a lot of fun collaborating with you on this. I am going to put my email in the chat, and it's up to you, Margaret. I'm throwing you under the bus once again. If you're willing to do that, if you have a question or if somebody comes up with, oh, here is a very specific thing, we would be happy to talk with you. Otherwise, again, because Margaret said, what if you are not in charge of the meeting? That's a great question, Christine. What if you're not in charge of the meeting? Margaret, do you want to take that or do you want me to?
You can take that.
So, you know, one thing is, let's just say sometimes you have zero power and the person who's running the meeting has all the power. Understood. Okay. So I'm not saying that this works for everything, but I think help, again, in those positive intentions, if someone is running a meeting and they're not doing some of these things, maybe saying to them ahead of time, hey, do you want me to help you put together an agenda and send it out? Hey, would you like me to take notes and share them with everybody? You can play some of those roles and help that person to be as effective as possible. So that's one of the things that you can do. You can ask effective questions. I said that earlier, if somebody calls a meeting and you don't know why you're having this meeting, is asking that question like, oh, hey, great, I'm glad we're going to meet. What is the intended outcome? It helps me to think about, to get ready for what we're going to talk about. If you tell me what the objectives are, it helps me if I have an agenda ahead of time. So you can ask those kinds of things and tee that person up for that. Mark says, please leave a meeting open to allow time to download docs and chat. Okay. Brittany, we can do that, right?
Yes, and then I was typing while you guys were talking, but if there's any resource that specifically that someone was not able to download, or if it would just be easier for me to share them in there all again, just let me know.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that kind of support, Brittany. And if you missed something, feel free to email us. And okay, great, Mark. I'm glad they all downloaded quickly. Isn't that great when our technology works? We're just so happy about that. And you guys, those of you who shared kind words in the chat, we appreciate that. Margaret and I will float on those words the rest of the day.
Absolutely.
And we thank you all for the important work that you're doing. And we thank ICSPS for their support for the workforce webinars. And other than that, we hope you have a wonderful Wednesday.